A few years ago, I spent a weekend in October driving up to Chaco Culture National Historic Park and walking a trail up near some mesas and checking out, I think it's the mesa right by the main Pueblo area, and it's that 5 mile loop. So I did that one, and then I started driving to Bandelier National Monument. And for a while, I was out of cell service. And along the way, an executive order was signed that came to be repeated throughout that presidency, that term in office, that declared the weekend of Columbus Day to also be Indigenous Peoples Day, a day of remembrance for Indigenous peoples across the United States of America and the Americas in general that were affected by colonial powers brought on by the expeditions of Christopher Columbus. As it reads, since time immemorial, American Indians, Alaska Natives, and Native Hawaiians have built vibrant and diverse cultures, safeguarding land, language, spirit, knowledge, and tradition across the generations. On Indigenous Peoples Day, our nation celebrates the invaluable contributions and resilience of Indigenous peoples, recognizes their inherent sovereignty, and commits to honoring the federal government's trust and treaty obligations to tribal nations. In the state of New Mexico, the state I call home, and the state where Chaco Culture National Historic Park and Bandelier National Monument and many other Native American related and Puebloan related national monuments and National Park Service properties call home, the governor in 2020 issued a statement as New Mexico celebrates Indigenous Peoples Day. Indigenous Peoples Day is an important opportunity to honor the culture and traditions of New Mexico's first citizens, our tribal brothers and sisters who make up such an important part of our state's beautiful multicultural identity. Tribal nations and their peoples have made incredible and unique contributions to not only our state, but this country we all love. This year, the tribal nations of New Mexico have suffered and persevered amid the pandemic and economic crisis, showing incredible resilience and strength in the face of challenging circumstances, demonstrating that we are all stronger when we look out for each other together. The state of New Mexico has not hesitated and will never hesitate to help protect and provide for the sovereign nations within our borders. On this Indigenous Peoples Day, I join all New Mexicans in celebrating the Indigenous nations and peoples of New Mexico and around the country and world, lifting up the diverse traditions, cultures, languages, and heritage in committing to support the health, well-being, and prosperity of Indigenous people today and every day. Hello, my name is Wildstag, and thank you for tuning in to another book rant. Today, I'm going to be covering a book relevant to the earlier explanations. This book is Indian Uprising on the Rio Grande, the Pueblo Revolt of 1680, written by Franklin Folsom with an introduction by Alfonso Ortiz. This is a short book. It's only about 130 pages long, but it is an incredibly important book and one that I purchased at the IPCC in Albuquerque, New Mexico, or the Indian Pueblo Cultural Center. I paid $18 for this, and I think it's a bit expensive for so short a book, but it's an important book nonetheless, and I think it's worth reading into and researching to some degree. The Indian Uprising on the Rio Grande discusses the Pueblo Revolt, which is one of a very small number of successful native revolts against a colonial power in what would come to be the continental United States of America. What the Pueblo Revolt did was something that was never repeated and ultimately might not have worked against the United States of America, but did work against the Spanish Empire. And for some context, the Spanish settlement of Santa Fe and the northernmost outposts of Spanish civilization were not endorsed by the crown, but were within regions that were already claimed by the Spanish Empire. The Spanish lived there for about 70 years before the local indigenous Puebloans united and fought back. And partly why this revolt worked was because Santa Fe and the Pueblo Revolt were on the furthest frontier of the Spanish Empire. From El Paso del Norte, which is now known as El Paso, and the Mexican side of the border is now called Juarez. From El Paso to Santa Fe, in between it rather, is a path called Jornada del Muerto, which is the journey of death. And this is a treacherous 90-mile trail that has to, because of the geography of New Mexico, separate from the Rio Grande, which at the time was the Rio Bravo. It has to separate by an order of like 10 to 20 miles. So anyone traveling through that area could not actually, get water. They couldn't, if it was, say, 5 miles away, they might have been able to refill water on a daily basis, go to the river and have outposts kind of near the river to get water. But the portion of New Mexico, modern day New Mexico, that the Jornada del Muerto passes through is treacherous. So Santa Fe was very far north. It was already frontier in the Spanish Empire just to get to El Paso. And then they had a treacherous path to get even further than El Paso. So it was isolated, and military action and military presence there was always going to be weak and low in number. And the Puebloans were able to use that through communication from a medicine man named Pope. And they didn't have a great way of coordinating simultaneous communications, simultaneous attacks. So what they did was they sent out strings of rope that had a certain number of knots in them. And every day, the leader of a village would untie a knot. And on the day, the destined day to start these simultaneous attacks, that would be the last knot. And everyone would know, this is the day we rise up against the Spanish. Now, as it turns out, someone alerted the Spanish to the actual plans. And so the Spanish were expecting an attack. But Pope and his people had planned for this. And so instead, the Pueblo Revolt happened the day before the last knot would have been untied, giving them a bit of advance notice, but everyone was already ready and in place. The simultaneous attacks on Santa Fe and the outlying communities of Spanish, it caused a lot of fear, panic, terror in this small community. And they all started retreating as refugees, and they retreated to the palace at Santa Fe, where the governor was holding as much of a defense as he could. They were besieged for a number of days, and a Puebloan Spanish, I forget exactly if he was a mixed person or not, but in a part of the revolt included deception. The people at the base that is now Albuquerque were not particularly affected by the Pueblo Revolt, but that was a garrison that had a certain number of troops. And the Puebloans managed to convince the governor at Santa Fe that that garrison had been defeated as well. And thus the Spanish believed a much greater military victory was taking place, and their response was to retreat everyone that they could. Now the Puebloans didn't hound them upon that retreat. They didn't keep on attacking the wagon trains or attacking the vulnerable people. Their goal was to run the Spanish out of their homeland, and that is what they did. So the Spanish retreated back down the Jornada del Muerto all the way back to El Paso del Norte, where they eventually regrouped and they eventually came back. And part of their return was about the context for what started the revolt in the first place, which is that the Spanish Empire was incredibly nasty and evil and horrendous to their subjects. They didn't accept anyone worshiping a religion, a faith, practicing a faith that was not the Catholic way. And so the Pueblo Revolt, part of its goal was to bring back the indigenous cultural values, the language, the religion, the rights, the brotherhoods and fraternities, these orders. And they were, for the most part, successful because the heart of those people groups were at stake. If they allowed the Spanish to remain, their culture would disappear. But not just that. The Spanish were cutting off limbs if people stood up against the Spanish. They were cutting off feet. They were cutting off hands if not enough gold or not enough corn or not enough resources were brought in, if not enough taxes were paid to the tax collectors. They could have hands, legs, ears, fingers cut off for the slightest of provocations by the Spanish. So the Pueblo Revolt in 1680 pushed the Spanish Empire all the way back down the Rio Bravo, back to El Paso del Norte. When they came back, the Spanish were cowed in a way. They were accepting of certain demands because they could only really hold onto their presence if they were working with the Puebloans that they lived around. And one of the conditions of their return was that the indigenous folk could keep their language and their faith, but they would have to take greater taxes and greater punishment if caught doing so in the open. Basically, they could keep their culture, but the Spanish wanted no part of it, and the Spanish wanted to punish those people more. When you give a group of people the option between convert to our way by force or keep your ways and will hurt you harder, the choice is obvious. Most people would rather keep their language, keep their religion, keep their culture alive, and accept greater taxes and greater difficulty because they can always weather that storm. And the Pueblo Revolt was to show the Spanish that they meant business, that they could unite and fight for what they believed in. When the Spanish came back, the land grants were written on paper and the agreements were written on paper. When the Mexican independence finally came around, part of the treaty, part of the end to that war was that the Spanish would honor the agreements they had made with indigenous peoples of the Spanish Empire. When Mexico eventually lost in the Mexican-American War, they also put on the papers those same kinds of conditions. Now, the USA has rarely, if ever, really truly honored those conditions. They allowed the Puebloans to keep their land per the land grants, but religion and language and culture were stamped out by the United States of America as best they could, leading to various aspects of New Mexican culture that a lot of New Mexicans now feel shame and pain to discuss and talk about. It is not the greatest moment in our history that we looked at these agreements and then ignored them and spat on the people and abused them and mistreated them and attempted a cultural genocide. A major component of this is the Zia symbol that you see on New Mexico's iconography all over the place, and I'll be honest, I myself am guilty of this, of using it. The Zia symbol is a symbol from one of the fraternal orders of the Zia Pueblo, a sacred symbol of the sun that has important meaning to men of a certain fraternal order within that community. Now, at the time, in the early 1900s, there were only about 24 people that still spoke the Zia Pueblo's language, and the population of the Pueblo had shrunk to about 60 to 80 people. So it was in danger of, in the perception of anthropologists, it was in danger of dying away. And anything dying away and disappearing is anathema to the way scientists perceive the world, that they need to understand everything, they need to document everything, they need everything they can to be taught to people that don't know it yet, that they can have these resources available. But to the indigenous, secrets are secret even in death. And when the Zia people realized that their symbol was being used on the state flag, they kind of bounced back in population and in cultural education and in language education in spite of New Mexico. To spite them, nowadays the Pueblo has 300 or so people. They've multiplied their numbers many times over in the last 100 years. Their language is now spoken by more than half of the people in the community, and that's at a fluent level. And at a semi-fluent level, the vast majority of Zia Puebloans understand or speak their language. The peoples of New Mexico, the indigenous people, have impressive histories, and the Pueblo Revolt is one of the most important aspects of understanding New Mexico history, how it shaped this multicultural region. So there are 19 pueblos, 3 reservations, 23 federally recognized tribes, a Spanish community that predates the American presence out here, and American culture all blending together in the state of New Mexico. And it's hard to go north of, it's hard to be near Albuquerque, north of Albuquerque, and not feel the presence of these people. Even where I live, near Alamogordo, New Mexico, there's Three Rivers Petroglyph Site, there's Gran Quivira National Historic Park, there's White Sands National Park, where ancestral indigenous American footprints are being found in the sand. On Holloman Air Force Base in the area, there are archaeologists whose job it is to uncover indigenous artifacts and archaeological sites on the base while construction is happening. There's the Tortugas Puebloans, the people that were brought with the Spaniards at the during the Pueblo Revolt, the natives that came with the Spaniards down to El Paso. There's the Puebloans in El Paso that are also descendants of locals that had been in that area for a long time, and those natives brought with the Spaniards during the Pueblo Revolt. And there's communities in Las Cruces, in El Paso, where these Puebloans aren't as federally recognized as they could be, and even the ones that are federally recognized have to fight tooth and nail for any land and the ability to keep their culture, to the ability to find ways to make money and survive in modern American culture. The Pueblo Revolt has a lot of rippling effects throughout New Mexican history. I think it does a disservice to this region when a president issues an executive order that declares a day Columbus Day and exclusively Columbus Day in spite of the indigenous peoples that have lived here for thousands of years. This book was great for education, and earlier I expressed that I think I would have preferred to pay less, but the $18 I did pay for this were money well spent. And learning all this history about New Mexico, and there is so much more that I could go in depth on, or you could do the research yourself. I can't cover even a fraction of a percent of the wealth of knowledge there is to learn about New Mexico and the indigenous people's impact on modern New Mexico. I don't think I could ever do it justice. That being said, I think if you have any interest in the history of the United States of America and its interactions and relationships with the native peoples of the United States of America, this is a good book for you to read. And I hope what I have done in this video is found a way to encourage you to do this research and read this book as well. My name is Wild Stag, and thank you for tuning in to another book rant.